Okay. Thank you so much for joining me, Dan. We're
No
joined
problem.
by
I'm
Dan Bisset. Can you just talk a bit about yourself and possibly your pronouns?
absolutely. So my name is Dan Bisset. I'm a student of classical studies with English at King's College London, and my pronouns are they, them. My research areas kind of specify into um, representations of transness in art and literature in classical antiquity, but also the influence of the Roman Empire on Hibernian myth and folklore. So I do a lot of work into how our Irish folklore has been affected by kind of the classical Mediterranean.
Awesome. Well, today we are going to be talking about the old Hibernian legends and sort of the Celtic era that the oral tradition that was written down around, I would say, around the 16th century. It was
Mhm.
fully written down. A lot of the accounts were written by English people, so sometimes they can be kind of skewed. As
Almost.
um, Gaeilge, as it stood, was a sort of an oral language. It wasn't really written down, was it?
No, not at all. Especially in the oral tradition of legend, there was a culture even in during the kind of the 600s AD where we believe a lot of this oral tradition kind of emanated from and originated in terms of like a concrete period of time where we can say, okay, this was definitely in circulation at this point.
Yeah.
In kind of the 600s, this kind of oral tradition was stemming from places like kind of the kind of Scandinavian oral tradition, but also kind of uh, a lot of influence of the same kind of we believe in Mediterranean oral tradition, and especially in Greek. And when we think of things like Homer, like the Odyssey and the Iliad, there was like a set bank of phrases that would be drawn on all the time, what we would call epithets for certain deities and for certain things like that. So, um, Homer describes Dawn as rosy fingered almost every single time it gets brought up. It's just kind of a like a trigger, something like that. So a lot of these oral traditions, when they come from the Mediterranean or whether they come from further northeast, will kind of inadvertently mix together and have different kind of um, ways of manifesting themselves. But definitely in the Celtic tradition, um, prior to the kind of the Catholic oppression of Irish culture, a lot of these pieces of epic were in the oral tradition rather than in the written.
And parts of them, I know some of them get misconstrued along with Catholicism. I think
Mhm.
as Ireland as a nation at the time, you had to think about St. Patrick coming over, but we still
Yeah,
held on to a lot of Celtic views. We still had druids and stuff. So a lot of the stories had to kind of accompany Catholicism along with the Celtic. So stories as we know them, such as Ushini Chirnanog and the Children of Lir, they're sort of added in with elements of St. Patrick and of, priests and stuff who bless these characters. But it's strange because almost their existence almost like um it criticizes Catholicism because it goes against everything that Catholicism stands for.
absolutely. And we see that a lot as well in Scottish folklore and mythology as well. That when Catholicism enters Ireland, especially Ireland, but Scotland also to a degree, and basically steamrolls over the entire literary tradition of Hibernian Ireland as we now know it. Um, Things like, for example, the Tuatha De Danann, which were the pantheon of Celtic Irish gods, are reduced to things like ancient kings or queens, or even in some cases we have evidence of kind of Catholicism denoting the Tuatha De Danann as fallen angels or things of that degree. But luckily, in the Irish Celtic tradition, in some ways their format, especially in a lot of the war epic that we have, things like the Táin Bó Cúailnge, a lot of these pieces of literature retain nearly their original form because they discuss, instead of gods and goddesses, which would have been conceived as blasphemous, they just discuss extraordinary people with extraordinary feat or extraordinary strength, instead of this kind of like pantheistic attitude. So I think that's why while I think it's why I think it's a reason why that the Catholic Church and Catholicism, as was kind of in that era of the kind of the 600s AD up until about the kind of the I would say up until about Reformation, a lot of these kind of creations of Celtic myth were left relatively unchanged. I would say up until about the Victorian era, where kind of the concept of what we now know as hibernophobia kicked in terms of hatred of Irish nationalism, where Victorian writers would essentially just strip back these pieces of epic, remove all kind of sexuality references, in terms of like depictions of sex and depictions of humor and things like that. I just think I think it's interesting how Catholicism allowed, especially Irish, Scottish folklore less so because it explicitly referenced gods and goddesses, on a pantheon level. That is to say, a certain group of gods and goddesses. But Irish folklore remains relatively untouched because of its capacity of presenting extraordinary characters rather than gods.
I think a lot of paganism was erased a lot as well, especially references to
Mm-hmm.
things that may sort of be seen in the Catholic scope as satanic or as paganistic. I know I was listening to somebody talk about the misconstrues of Ushini Nog, which is possibly, I think, one of the most popular of these stories.
Mm-hmm.
We had to study it for secondary school for leaving cert. And the story is vastly different to how it was written down. And the story that we study and is more widely known is based off of a poem that was written in I think the 1800s, so much
Yeah.
later. I know characters such as Neve Canor were changed from this very pagan symbol of a unclothed female body with the head of an animal to sort of this blonde Scandinavian lady on a white horse, which is more kind of accustomed to our Catholic views and our Catholic imagery.
Very much so. I think especially of one of my personal favorite pieces of Irish folklore, The Children of Lear, um, with with Aoife originally being the child of Borg, who was the replacement kind of head god, if you will, of the Tuatha Dé Danann, eventually just being kind of construed as a bad woman rather than a goddess. And I think it just, like you said, it kind of calls back to that erasure of paganism, even though you see at the end of even at the end of the original Children of Lear story, without the kind of the pagan erasure, where paganism and Catholicism in the form of Saint Patrick, or a Catholic monk. Every single retelling of the Children of Lear includes some kind of reference to a monk or Saint Patrick or one of those things. But you see Catholic. And you see in that blessing of these inherently pagan characters, there is an underlying sense of the purification of these kind of savages who are practicing paganism, but also you see this kind of existence of paganism and Catholicism kind of coexisting in some sphere. It shows that Catholicism existed at some point separate from the Children of Lear, but also that pagan culture and ritual and that kind of aspect of the magic of paganism, it was allowed to coexist at least until kind of a Victorian age.
Yeah, it is very strange, the adding in, and they're almost shoehorned in sometimes. I know in the Children of Lear, this monk just shows up for very little reason to bless these people so that their souls can arise in heaven after they turn really old. And in Ushini Nog, St. Patrick comes in afterwards, sort of to bless him as well. So it's very strange. It is a very strange adding of Catholicism and Catholic views almost, because the thing about these stories is that they're taken over by Catholicism, but they don't hold Catholic views. I mean,
Very
they're
much so.
not. If you're talking about Catholic stories, they always have a moral lesson to them, which teaches you something about the Bible. These don't hold any sort of moral lessons or anything, as much as they are just entertaining stories.
Absolutely, I agree. I would say that probably the one big exception to that would be the Táin Bó Cúailnge, which is probably, I mean, it's been called the Irish Iliad. Like it is a mammoth text, and it's a text that you have the opportunity to study at leaving cert classics, but not many people do. But it really is a phenomenal piece of work, um, and there is actually quite a lot of mirroring between the Iliad itself and the Táin Bó Cúailnge, and it becomes kind of this. I mean, the upshot of events of the Táin basically is that Queen Maeve of Connacht and King Ailill of Ulster are like comparing their wealth, and it's basically like a contest of who's the better ruler, basically. And they're neck and neck, and then Ailill says, "Well, look at me, I have the most. Like, I have a fertile bull. Like, what can you have to match that?" And Maeve doesn't have anything, and it's like, "Oh, like crap, I need to get a bull." And then basically the Táin Bó Cúailnge basically describes the journey to get this bull, and it's a war story basically where the tribes of Ulster and the tribes of Connacht go to war over this bull. And Queen Maeve eventually gets the bull after the death of Cuchulainn and the death of Ferdy, and basically everyone dies. But when Queen Maeve gets the bull, Queen Maeve's bull fights King Ailill's bull, and Queen Maeve's bull kills King Ailill's bull, but dies of exhaustion like immediately afterwards. So it's kind of this like what I would say the moral of that story is that it's everything kind of the futility of comparing, but yeah, absolutely the futility of war and the futility of these comparison competitions, and probably also kind of a foreboding message to the kings of Ireland and the queens of Ireland to kind of watch it, like don't like and especially when you consider at the time of the writing of the Táin Bó that the Roman Empire was very much knocking on that door, and it was like, we're around the corner, like we've conquered. Ireland is pretty much the only part of Western Europe that was untouched, completely untouched by the Roman Empire. So it was kind of a story kind of promoting unity, I think, more than anything, and saying like, don't be fighting your brothers and sisters for a cow, you know?
I think that's very important to discuss in a contemporary context, I think, of Ireland has such a history of different aspects of Irish people pitting each other against each other. So
Mm,
it's a very prevalent story today, and that story is actually, it seems almost Shakespearean in its
mm.
gore and its futility of almost like the amount of death in it shows almost the futility of life, you know?
Absolutely. And it's hugely graphic. It's a hugely graphic saga of, love and of like brotherhood and of evil. It's a pretty dark saga. I think I would say, in my research of Hibernian folklore, I would kind of venture to say that the myth of Celtic Ireland is a lot gorier than the myth of the ancient
Yeah.
Mediterranean, I would say.
I think it's because, I mean, a lot of it is, I know we learned these stories as kids. Obviously not, I don't remember learning that one. It's very adult of a story, but they're almost sanitized really through the
Very
Catholic
much so.
ending of it. It's sanitized in, oh, very few people die in these Celtic stories really.
Mm,
Sometimes they die at the very end, but there's not a lot of gore in it. They sort of transform into these old men and they kind of die on the spot of old age. There's
yeah.
not a lot of um, gore and violence in it. So it's a cleanliness of these stories, and I think it withholds sort of the Celtic um, sensibilities of it. I think the Celts as people valued life very differently to the people on the mainland of Europe.
Very much so. I think about what I call the Disneyfication of like the Brothers Grimm and the kind of
Yeah,
Hans Christian Andersen saga fairy tales, where these like stories for children are really like horrific and really kind of like, well, there is no happy ending. And I think that I would venture to say that kind of the Catholic Church as a precursor to Disneyfication is kind of just to implement moral principles into the people that they are. I hesitate to say ruling because the Catholic Church just kind of injects itself into already existing empires, but you know what I mean, that kind of
they
concept
want
of
to do
of
that.
yeah, absolutely. And it's just kind of uh, the people that it oppresses more than rules, but to imbue moral principles into its peoples rather. But I think the Celts just didn't really see the point in that. They had their own moral principles that they abided by of kind of fraternity and kind of unity, and like obviously they were going to war against each other like every day because they were greedy. But I think that like that just comes with territorial boundary, and who will be the king of Ireland rather than the king of the province.
I think our as Hibernia as an individual state separate to mainland Europe, it was very easy for the English and for the other countries to see us as savages, purely because
Absolutely.
we had such a different value for life. I mean, not Queen Maeve, Grania Whale is seen as this,
Mm.
scary pirate lady of a mass proportion and a very, but she really didn't do that much other than she had a different value on life than the
Mm.
rest of mainland Europe, and it scared people. And I think it led to how easy it was to vilify Irish people and make us seem almost like a lesser species of human.
She was a successful savage, but not only was she a successful savage, she was a successful woman savage, let alone anything else. And I think that the Grania Whale saga, I think, is to me, it really is kind of the triumph of the kind of what I'm calling the Hibernian spirit
Yeah,
in terms of the pre uh what's it called, pre the battle of the battle of Kinsale. It kind of is a testament to that kind of pre English kind of oppression of Ireland, I think. And it's like she was a phenomenal woman, and she was phenomenally effective at what she was able to do, and that scared the shit out of people. It
her
was
trials
terrifying.
were insane. They were
Mm,
huge. Obviously, I would imagine that they were probably made bigger through the telling of tall tales and the legend that was Grania Whale. But even
yeah.
historically, to be a woman and to be a pirate and to sacrifice her feminine, like we had different views on gender. She
Mm,
sacrificed her femininity completely. I know whale is another word for bald. She was Grania
yeah.
bald. She sacrificed her hair to become a pirate. And she was a legend in her own right, even beyond the tall tales of Grania Whale and
Mm,
her stories.
yeah, absolutely. And I think you raise a good point about the kind of the sacrificial aspect of gender and kind of femininity in the Hibernian myth context. And a lot of these cycles are where the classical, and when I say classical, I mean the Greco-Roman cycles of epic, where they really fall short in comparison to um, the Irish cycles of myth. And I speak especially about the Ulster cycle, which is the kind of Cuchulainn cycle, as it's
Yeah,
more commonly known. But then also the Fenian cycle, which is like Phil McCool and kind of that cycle of myth, is that the women involved in these narratives are not only are they essential, but more often they act as aids rather than hindrances
yeah,
to
always.
the hero. Pretty much always. One of the glaring examples that I can think of that is an antithesis of that would be Aoife in the Tonbo Chúlinge saga, who is the evil sister. There's something about Aoifes in Irish mythology that they really don't like Aoifes.
It is very, yeah, vilifying of Aoife. Possibly one. There was one Aoife who inspired the name of the next Aoife, who inspired the name of the
Yeah,
next Aoife. But it is
almost definitely.
all the villains are Aoifes.
Aoifes, yeah, very much so. But I think as well that like, they presented female characters as multifaceted rather than having one intention. And I think again, there obviously will be some there obviously will be some uh, exclusions to that concept of the aid rather um, than the hindrance, especially in classical myth. There are, especially in theater. There, I mean, the Greeks were by no means feminist in any shape or form, but the way that they presented female characters in their tragedy more so than anything else was very interesting. But in their epic, definitely. I mean, you think of the Iliad and you think of Helen of Troy is basically the reason why all of these men are dying. Um, you know,
Cora.
Briseis. Yeah, absolutely. Briseis is is the concubine of Achilles, who Agamemnon steals, and that's why Achilles isn't in the fight, and that's why he's moaning away. So it's this kind of sense of vilifying femininity, basically, as being the root of evil.
Yeah.
And I think what Irish myth and folklore does really well is it presents these really compelling female characters. Like Queen Maeve is obviously like an amalgamation of evil in the story, but she's a very complex character, and she's not presented. And I think of the final scene in which we see Queen Maeve, where Cuchulainn is finds her basically, and says like I you know, your army is finished. I'm gonna end you. And Maeve is presented throughout the whole narrative as this very strong stoic woman. I'm gonna get this bull and I'm gonna wipe down the entire army of Ulster if I have to. And we find Maeve in the final scene like taking a piss. So it's this kind of like, it builds up this character as this kind of grand matriarch of Ireland, and suddenly it's reduced immediately. I think it's such a compelling. But I think that the women that are presented are, you know, so complex and multifaceted. There are some, yes, that end up sacrificing what we kind of would conceive as that standards of gender for Celtic times, where a woman. But I mean, even that concept is very, very blurry from what we know, that women could be, you know, fierce and mighty warriors, and there would be no difference if you decided to be a, you know, to be a family maker and a homemaker.
I don't think, yeah. I mean, oftentimes they're very categorized in the way that a lot of folklore is, where women are often either magical, a matriarch, or the villain, you know?
Mm.
And oftentimes, sometimes they're all three, you know?
Mm.
Aoife from the Children of Lur is all three.
Yes.
So it's um, women oftentimes, especially in these stories, in these epics, they hold a magical innate power that almost insinuates that every woman has it, you know?
Mm.
You think of oh, what was that? Oisin's mother was a deer maiden. She was half deer, you know?
Mm.
And so it's almost all of them have a magical element to them. Not a lot of them
Very
are
much so.
heroes by their own mind, other than possibly Grania Whale, who was a lot later
Mm.
on. But she, yeah, they hold an innate um, magical sensibility that isn't. It's rarely ever evil, and it must be
Absolutely.
said that Ireland as a country was very unique in the way that they treated witches as well as druids and other magical entities, where we didn't fear them and
Mm.
we respected them as people. We had the least amount of witch hunts or witch burnings or witch trials because we respected them so much, and we lived in a society where we withheld Catholic views, but we also respected the Celtic elders.
Absolutely. And I think that's also a testament to the folklore enduring, I think, and the coexistence of Catholicism in some form or another. We don't hate Aoife because she's a witch. We hate her because she turned Lear's children into swans, which I think is, and I think that would always be the example. I think the Children of Lear is a perfect example, and it's not very long. I mean, it's long enough that you get something out of it, but the myth itself is pretty easy to condense. And
It's
I
a
think that,
cleaner story.
yeah, absolutely. And it's not too convoluted. Like obviously the Taun is like it's a brilliant text, but you could summarize it like it's very difficult to pin down and explain with any kind of nuance. But I think the Children of Lear, the way that it works, especially in terms of its displays of femininity, we have the contrasting characters of Aoife and Fionnuala, for example, who are, you know, obviously Fionnuala is the eldest daughter and takes charge of the whole, you know, of her brothers and sister. And I think that like like I said, we don't hate Aoife because, you know, and because she's a witch. We hate her because she's just an evil person. But that evilness is separate from her magicness. That's not a word, but it's separate from her magical quality.
Yeah, and it must be said how I love the story of the children lyrics so much. It must be said that the reasons why she transformed them into the swans to represent sort of the elegance of the children. They're so, like, obviously she was jealous of them because they were so beautiful, so she transformed them into these elegant um, creatures that are silent. So she silenced these creatures, you know.
Yeah. And I think like the concept of like only being able to communicate through birdsong is such a compelling image. And I think that like again, this is kind of this is kind of a it's interesting that the kind of the concept of jealousy,
Yeah.
especially when talking about Aoife's character, because Aoife, despite all of her flaws and despite being, the villain of the story, is still unable to bring herself to kill her sister's children.
No, no,
And
no.
I think
He's able to.
absolutely, and she cannot compel herself to do so. And I think that there is kind of some kind of like I can't kill my and there's a whole thing about infanticide in mythology, which is why something like Medea, the Sophocles play is so oh no Euripides the Euripides play Medea is such a shocking thing that a mother killing her children is completely unheard of.
Yeah.
And I think that I think presenting Aoife in that way, not being able to kill Eve's children, is like a kind of a subtle nod to say, okay, like evil woman, whatever, but there is she's not completely malevolent. Like she's not I mean, what she did was pretty horrible, but like she's
She,
not consumed by evilness.
yeah. I wonder, like, swans are such interesting animals in mythology. I know a lot of similarities can be drawn between the children of Lear and the Russian folktale that inspired Swan Lake, where
Hmm.
a magical sorceress transforms these people into swans. They're cursed to be a swan forever. And to me, a swan is a pretty nice animal to be turned to. It certainly isn't a lot like Circe, who transforms them into pigs. You
Yeah,
know,
very much.
it would be
Yeah,
horrible to be a pig. I think it would be pretty nice to be a swan. So it seems
yeah,
almost
absolutely.
forgiving to transform them into a swan, which is a pretty positive animal to be transformed into.
I think so. And I think as well. Not only does it mirror, I mean, there are several similarities between um, um, Mediterranean, classical Mediterranean myth and classical Irish myth. I think really dominantly of the story, especially when I'm talking about Children of Lear and Swan Lake and this kind of swan metaphor about Leda and the Zeus and Leda, and Leda was
Yeah.
transformed into a swan, and gave birth to Zeus's children, which ended up being Castor and Pollux, the two boys, and then the two girls were Clytemnestra, who is the kind of the backstory of the Aristeia, kills Agamemnon. It's a whole other saga, but also Helen of Troy. So it's kind of it goes back to um, this testament of swans as a motif that crop up again and again in classical myth. And I think that the
It's a
swan as an image is really compelling because it begins as it begins as like this kind of it's almost like the story of the ugly duckling. It begins as this kind of like down with is that the right word? When a swan is like grey, it's not completely formed properly yet. And it grows these like beautiful feathers, but there are also these kind of silently inward characters. And I think that Aoife transforming the children into swans, but cursing them with the like with the curse or the gift, depending on how you look at it, of longevity, and forcing them to survive in silence essentially for 900 years is really really I think that
it's
yeah,
per-
while
it to
yeah,
me it's
essentially,
more cruel than turning them into swans and then not giving them longevity.
absolutely,
It's cruel.
absolutely. And I think that the punishment of Aoife by her transforming into whatever it is, like an air, I think it's an air demon at the end in the original,
Yeah.
not in the sanitized version, shall we say, but in the original, Aoife is transformed into an air demon by her father. And I think that punishment definitely does fit the crime.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the image of a swan is so specific for folklore. It's a
Mm.
specific animal, certainly, to include in sort of these animals pop up time and time again in folklore. I think of a deer is constantly used, a pig is constantly used, a horse is constantly used, and a swan is always used. Such a specific animal. You don't see a chicken popping up or a cow of
No,
some kind. It's it's
lots
very
of cows in Greek mythology,
real.
actually.
Mm.
Lots of cows. and because they worship the cow as a precursor to what we understand as Greek in terms of kind of post what we call the Mycenaean era. So once kind of the expansion of Crete kind of ceased and there was a lot of things like that, they worshipped the cow. But I agree. I think the swan as an image is really compelling as well because it's the presentation of this sense of calm, and it literally glides, but underneath all the paddling that's
So
being done
much pressure and panic to it.
to simply get, move on the water so delicately. And you see it often all the time in Russian traditional dancing where they wear extremely long dresses where they're able to move almost like dolls, where they paddle, so to speak, really fast with their feet, and they move at tiny steps but at a really rapid speed, so it literally looks like they're floating. And I think that kind of sense of panic, I think, is a really good image for the incoming kind of Anglo-Saxon invasion of Ireland, and the Battle of Kinsale. I think that's a really kind of, obviously happens a lot later, happens
Yes.
nearly like nearly 1,000 years later actually. But it kind of is that sense of making sure that the Roman Empire is close by. They already have England. They already have most of Wales. They've already set up military bases in like places like Caerwent, and they're essentially, like, you can see them from across. You can see them from the east coast on a clear day.
So, how do you feel about the ideas of gender which were upheld in Celtic society and how that shifted almost with the incoming invasion of St. Patrick and bringing forth of Catholicism in Ireland? How did gender change?
I would say that a lot of the views and the changes, and they were seismic changes, make no mistake about that, can be traced back to the Romans, especially, and Roman beliefs, and even and then from the Romans, obviously the Greeks, and then from the Greeks. But we'll stick with Romans because they were the dominant empire at the time. Catholicism would never have been as popular, and I mean that in terms of notoriety rather than overall like
Popularity.
for the religion. Yeah. Um, would never have been as big as it is today without the Roman Empire. And I think that Roman concepts of what it means to be a woman, and what it means to be a man, and what it means to be a citizen, and what it means to be a non-citizen are imbued by Roman aspect of the same. And in Rome, especially in Rome, and we see it in Greece as well, but we have a lot more documentation of Rome, obviously, because it was not only longer but it endured. Um, Women weren't citizens, so we see a huge amount of. I mean, we see it in their architecture where they have literally structured class systems within their theaters where the women and the slaves sit at the very very back, and then it progresses more upper class the further down and the closer to the stage that you get with the emperors and the senators sitting at the close. So things like that where we see women are expected to be seen and not heard, and women are expected to bear children, and women are expected to be faithful but still not become outraged if the husband is unfaithful and things like that. So I think that those aspects of femininity, and I use that term very loosely because the Catholics didn't really have that kind of, the Celts didn't really have that concept.
No.
And you see that perfectly exemplified, the clash, because obviously the Romans didn't get to Ireland, but we see that clash between Celtic women and the Roman general populace with Boudica.
Yeah.
And Celt, and a Celtic leader who is a woman, and who is a fierce warrior, and who basically decimated the Roman Empire in Britain, destroyed London, destroyed what we now know as London, but destroyed Londinium, the Roman colony at Londinium. So I think that once Catholicism was adopted as the official religion, and once the pantheon of Roman gods was essentially abolished, not really, it was a smooth transition out of it. But once Catholicism was adopted, and then the same notions were reflected, and we saw that in Ireland up until the 80s and 70s with things like the contraception referendums and the divorce referendums, where women
again.
Absolutely, and it's still the idea of what it means to be an Irish woman is is constantly in flux, and it never it always comes under question, in my opinion, for the better, 100% for the better.
Absolutely.
But the Catholic Church especially views that as a threat to womanhood, when in fact they were the ones threatening the womanhood of of Celtic Ireland.
They were the ones that defined womanhood. Womanhood
Absolutely,
didn't exist in Celtic society because gender was, it was there, but it was less defining of a woman. I know
absolutely,
under Breton law, women could get divorced for now it had to be for a multitude of reasons. They couldn't get divorced for no reason, and a
mm,
lot of Breton law did not protect women and viewed women as um,
brilliant.
second class citizens. But I think that was afterwards. I think during early parts of Breton law, women were respected just as much as men were.
Absolutely. And women were allowed to make the choice between, fierce warlord and leader,
Mm-hmm.
or simply just wanting to raise children. And I think that's something that is thankfully coming back with the new wave of feminists, and the new wave of feminism, where women are being offered the opportunity. Okay, if you want to be, a stay-at-home mom, and if you want to raise kids, that's fine. What protections can we put in place for you to ensure that you're being protected? But if you want to be, if you want to make a if you want to do what you want to do, we'll make sure that we're able to do that. I think the Celts had that attitude as well, especially in respect to how they treated their women, especially, and they revered them. The women that were fierce in battle, and were successful, especially in battle, were revered on a pedestal, on the same pedestal, oftentimes even higher than the men doing the exact same thing. So it
Yeah.
really was I mean, it would be amiss of me to describe the Celtic societies as feminist, because they weren't really. It was, it still was very difficult to be a woman,
It's definitely not, but
very much so.
they were separate to the Mediterranean views of womanhood and femininity.
Absolutely. And it makes me think that if the British Empire, as we now understand it to be, from, what would the Roman opinion, because the Romans thought that the British, as in the Celts who were living on the on the British Isles at the time, were also savages. So it makes me think that, if the Roman Empire hadn't conquered the island of Britain, um, like, how would they be viewed today? Would they be viewed as equally as savage as the Irish were in the 1700s and the 1800s? Would they have been viewed with the same lens? I just think it's interesting.
It is very interesting. It's sort of, to me, it's scary how quickly the British then, the British were saying very similar. I can't say the same in values as the Celts, and then Rome came over, took it over, and then they almost felt the same way about us, where we were savages, but we withheld the same views up until that point. So they were in no meaning mind to judge, yet they did, and it led into horrible views of Irish people that withstood until the late 1800s. You know,
I would, I
in
would,
the
I would
early
go further than
20th
that.
century.
I would go further than that. I would say that those attitudes towards Irish people endured well into the 80s, I would say.
Too. Horrible things were said about Irish people under Thatcher's Britain, and
Mm.
sometimes, obviously, definitely not as extreme. Like it is ridiculous to compare to the racism that other people have to go through. But we withhold sort of, English people sort of have an ignorance towards Irish people and Irish people's views, um, which is insane to think that we're their neighbors and they know so little about how we run our own country.
Also, how, like, not only how we run our own country, but how they ran our country on our behalf for 800 years.
Yeah,
Not like it was like it's kind of the oblivion to Irish, like, Anglo-Irish, and I hate that phrase so much, but it's the ignorance to the Anglo-Irish relationship.
yeah,
And I think I think it can be said as well for the Hibernian Roman relationship, because in Rome, and people have written about this in terms of, like, on a historical level, um like, that there was very little known about the Hibernian peoples, so to speak. But
yeah,
people, like Claudius, and people, who were writing about the people who were writing about the Hibernian people were seemed to be very you know, inferent on who we were as a people. And you know, Tacitus and you know these huge like people writing huge compendiums of the history of Rome, the Roman Empire, that is, unable to unable to really get a lot about the Hibernian Irish people. And I think had it been a simple, okay, like you know, I think a lot more could have been done to kind of expand that out.
Why do you think that they were less interested in Hibernia than Britain?
They tried so many times to get to attack the Hibernian people, and I think they tried so many times they just got tired. They said, "Look, it's a small island, not as rich in from their envoys because they had people there. They had people there that were living among the Hibernian people, very peacefully, and that they had envoys." And not a lot of material resources there. It was mostly forest at that time. You have to remember it was
Yeah.
the 600s. Very little, to be, no visible quarries, no huge amount of resources. A lot of it was in the north of Ireland. When we see in Bronze Age civilization, and we see, the Bronze expansion outwards. These people are, they just said it wasn't worth it in the end, and they would have. I think they would have taken a more serious view of it if the Hibernians were hostile towards the Roman Empire without the Roman Empire attacking first. The Romans essentially respected the Hibernian view of defense. And they said, look, if we're coming over to you and we want to take over you and you're defending yourselves and it's just not working or we're not getting through, that's fine. At least you're not attacking us to gain control of us. So the way that the tribes on the British Isles were, because when you think about it, the Roman Empire had control of what we now understand as France, but they obviously called it Gaul. And when you think about how close France is to England, it's a hop, skip, and a jump away. You can see the two countries. You can literally swim it. So so the Romans were a little bit more apprehensive about the island of Britain and the tribes that lived there. And I think it's interesting what you say about how the Roman implementation and the ridding of the Celts on the island of on the British Isle on to the right. Yeah. And I think that it's interesting because it's not even that they got rid of them; they literally just pushed them north. And we're unable, like with Ireland, we're unable to conquer those people, which is obviously essentially, it is the story behind Hadrian's Wall, and it is the reason why Hadrian's Wall existed, and so the Emperor Hadrian, building this colossal wall that spans not exactly, but essentially from coast to coast, from the west coast to the east coast, because they just said, look, if as long as you don't bother us, we won't, we'll just leave you alone now. It's not worth it. We have what we need. We have these resources. We have Wales to the west. We have all of these mining resources in kind of the north of England, where they just before Hadrian's Wall. So once they had pushed the Celtic tribes as north as they possibly could, they said, right, that's fine. We have what we need. Yeah. Let's just focus on keeping it.
Did they ever? I know Iceland is just a little bit further than us. Did they ever go to Iceland?
No, again, they just said that very similar to Ireland actually. Again, Iceland at that time again was mostly forests, and they were working with kind of Scandinavian is a modern term, but I'm just using it in that sense. In the kind of the northeastern tribes, were very accustomed to a very different climate to the Mediterranean climate that the Romans were used to. So they said, for the sake of it, they left them alone, which in hindsight probably wasn't a good idea, because those were the exact tribes that came down and basically decimated the Roman Empire towards its falling.
Yeah, bad planning.
Yeah.
Do you overall think that it was a positive or a negative that Rome decided to leave us alone? Because it meant that we got to keep a lot of our history and our culture that was
for a little bit longer.
Yeah, for a little bit longer overall, then it made the relations between Britain and Ireland so poor.
I agree. I think that as the kind of the Anglo-Saxons, took over after the fall of the Roman Empire, and then when you look at things like the Normans, it got to the point where the Normans just wanted more, and the Normans said it was less about resources and more about power. Yeah. And I think that the as sad as it is, especially as someone who is, as proud of Ireland and as a as Republican as I think both of us are, the conquest of Ireland was inevitable. I
Yeah.
think because it was so small.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And when you think about it, and when you, I mean, to be honest, I'm surprised that, but I mean, not really because I study them now, but excuse me, in the past, I was always surprised that the Romans didn't conquer Ireland or Hibernia.
Yeah.
But I think that the
Seems
Romans were smart.
West
Say
because
that again?
society we were tribed, so
Hmm.
it seemed like something that would be rather simple.
Absolutely. And you would think that, but I think the Romans knew when to pick their battles,
Yeah.
and they knew where to fight. They knew that they knew to be sensible. I mean that goes back to Alexander the Great. Now that's a bad example because Alexander was so beyond cocky. But they knew, and the army as a whole knew that once they got to about the Hindu Kush River, that's when they needed to kind of give it up. Now they had gotten as far as they could. They never conquered the whole of India, and I knew right it was time to go. And I think that Roman sense of knowing when to pick your battles was
Yeah.
an essential. The conquest of what is now England and Wales um, was necessary because it was so close in proximity to the British. Sorry, it was so close in proximity to what the Roman Empire was, and I think had Hibernia and the Celtic tribes of Hibernia been more hostile towards the Roman Empire while they were in England and Wales, I think that there probably would have been more capacity for taking it over and conquesting them. But I think the Romans just simply said it's just not worth it. But because they were smart, they were more about resources and um kind of populace rather than greed and fame and notoriety, which I believe the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons were, which I think is why the Norman conquest of Ireland was so brutal, because they were so miffed at, I think they were like, sure, look, like, we're doing what the Romans couldn't do, so we need to go ham, we need to make a spectacle of this. And I think that's why then that kind of heavy boot really on the Irish spirit was
Yeah.
was there for a long time.
Now, Hibernia and the Celts lived so close to Roman society. Was there a lot of mixing in the legends and stories?
I would say that there was never any, for example, there was never any like overlap between the myths of ancient Rome and the myths of Celtic Hibernia. There
They
was
never,
never any like crossover.
no.
There was never any crossovers. However, I would argue personally that obviously Homer was writing in an age of, obviously pre-Christianity. So the epics of Homer and the oral tradition of Homer and the oral tradition of Yugoslavia, as we come to understand it, as the Yugoslav and the Slavic oral tradition, either inspired or was inspired by, we're not 100% sure yet, by the Homeric oral tradition. And the Homeric oral tradition happened 500-600 years before the Irish oral tradition, at least. And we have obviously the only dates really that we know for sure of an original source text are probably the Taun, to be honest, and because the Taun's cycles were preserved. So I would say that there's a lot of inspiration and there's a lot of mirroring, for example. So the hero, I'm thinking especially of the Iliad because that's what the Taun is mirrors the most.
Yeah.
That Cuchulainn in the Taun mirrors Achilles in the Iliad. They both are, heroes that are necessary to defeat the rest of the army. They defeat a huge proportion of the army single-handedly. And there is also some kind of homoerotic subtext between, obviously hugely popular now because of the book Song of Achilles, which actually is it's a good fiction read. I wouldn't use it as a historical source in any shape or form, but it's a good read if you're interested in that kind of thing. But the relationship and the explicitly homoerotic relationship between Achilles and Patroclus, and the relationship, I tend to read it as homoerotic, but maybe that's just the queer lens of Irish mythology. But between Cuchulainn and Ferdiad. And I think both of their lovers, both of the heroes' lovers end up dying. And that is what kind of sets them off, so to speak. And so I think there definitely are a lot of mirrorings between definitely the Iliad, for example, but also I just think generally the oral tradition seems to kind of they seem to mirror each other a lot. And I was just looking there that the Iliad was written in the 8th century BC. So we're talking nearly, the guts of 1,000 years between these two stories that start very differently and have very different motivations. But if you look at the skeletal
The
kind
overall
of outlines of them,
themes remain the same.
very,
It's very
very
interesting.
much so.
Do you think that's possibly the overlap, or do you think that is just a universal theme that is a coincidental in the way that they relate? Are there any other examples of similar stories?
In terms of like different parallels that you can draw between
Yeah, are
Roman
there
myth.
any other parallels across any other of the written texts
Well,
of the world?
I would say like transformations are a huge one.
Yeah,
I mean, a story that has a huge amount of transformation on what is kind of known as the um as known as the kind of the Bible of transformations, and actually really does mirror the Bible in a lot of ways. I
yeah,
mean, the first is the Metamorphosis by Ovid, and Ovid wrote the Metamorphosis kind of in about 8 AD. So we're talking like 200 years after the Taun. And a lot of these transformative myths, like I said, mirror the Bible. I mean, the first book of the Metamorphosis is essentially in the beginning there was light, and God, it's very very similar. And you read it. Actually, I'll see if I have it here. I'll be able to find a copy of it and I'll read it because it really is quite startling. And I was reading this. I was on a train journey to Hitchin, and I was reading this on the train, and I was just kind of like this. This could be like at weddings and funerals you have the same kind of the stock script. I was saying this would be great for a wedding or a funeral. So this is the Metamorphosis by Ovid, and it starts. Ere land and sea and the all-covering sky were made, in the whole world the countenance of nature was the same. All one, well-named chaos, a raw and undivided mass. And it goes on and basically talks about,
yeah,
chaos. And then it's kind of so into shape, whatever god it was, reduced the primal matter and prescribed its several parts. Then first to make the earth, even on every side, he rounded it into a mighty sphere. Then bade the sea extend and rise, and blah blah. But you can see the similarities in between that. It is rather startling.
very
So I
similar.
would say that. Things like the metamorphosis and transformation, and there's obviously so many stories. And I mean, you think of any story from Rome that you know about, it probably is in the metamorphosis and probably
Yeah,
comes from that. It is a work of it's a work of fiction based on like theology,
yeah,
in that it's kind of representations of things. And the Romans believed it. The Romans used that as their Bible, and they used it very much as their kind of creation story. But I would say that things like Ovid and things like Homer, I'm thinking more specifically of because it was a precursor. That the envoys in Hibernia probably did hear of probably knew of Homer, and definitely knew of it because they were Roman, but they probably did have access to Homer. So it's very possible that there was some crossover in between. Yeah, that the Celtic peoples heard of Homer. And there's a lot of conversation actually at the moment, and there's some really great papers being written about the Celtic overlap in kind of Homeric epic, and how the Taun mirrors the Iliad in a lot of ways.
that is very interesting. And transformation is a theme that picks up both a lot in Celtic mythology and a lot in Roman mythology, especially the stories that I'm obviously not very educated in Roman and Greek mythology. I had quite a big interest as a child in it, but a lot of the Greek stories and a lot of the Roman myths involve a god transforming into an animal of some sort, or a god cursing a human by transforming them into a creature or a monster. I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of overlap happens in Celtic mythology of either a god transforming into an animal in order to trick a human, or a god or magical entity transforming a human into a animal or a monster as a curse almost.
Yeah, I think especially of the myth of Arachne, the weaver who
That's
challenged Athena.
enough. Yeah.
She gets turned into a spider, and that's obviously where then arachnid comes from, and there's the whole thing. Um, I think that the capacity for transformation. I actually wrote a paper on this about transformation and gender and sexuality for a publication, and the way that Ovid presents these characters, especially in references to gender, and we'll talk about sexuality to a degree as well, but gender, obviously, since we were talking about kind of things like femininity, is that through the transformation, these norms and these expectations of gender are usually flipped. And if they're not flipped, they're already flipped to begin with before the transformation. And then once they're transformed, they subvert back to the societal norm. So it's very interesting. I mean, I am not a fan of Ovid for different reasons. I just think he was a bit of a creep. And a lot of the metamorphosis is very much like about sexual violence and about about rapes and about sexual assault. But I think that
In
that, that, that
mythology, sexual assault and rape occurs quite a lot, especially in gods
yeah,
raping humans.
gods raping humans, and also gods cursing mortals because of the actions of a rape by the gods. One such example in the Metamorphosis, for example, is the story of Helios, where Helios rapes a mortal woman because he's so enamored with her, and the woman is buried alive because she was raped by the god and dies, buried alive and dies, and I think it's interesting that the gods are not only excused but oftentimes facilitated. And I also think of the recent revival in Medusa apologists, of whom I am one of, who are kind of saying that, well, Medusa actually was a victim in that situation. She was a victim of sexual assault at the hands of Poseidon, and the discussion now has moved away from was Medusa right or wrong, and what were the intentions of Medusa, much more now to the intentions of Athena. Was Athena blessing Medusa by protecting her from Poseidon by turning her into a vicious gorgon, or was Athena cursing her? I think it's such an interesting conversation. I myself don't really know where I lie because there's a lot of conflicting evidence to support both arguments in a lot of detail.
Were the children of Ler blessed with longevity, or were they cursed
Yes,
with longevity? You know,
very much so. Very much so. Was it a blessing that they were able to live their lives out until they were 900 years old, or was it a curse? And I think as well, that's definitely another crossover. These kind of concepts of, is it a blessing or is it a curse? And oftentimes the gods will, especially in Roman mythology, I'm speaking about now. In Roman mythology, the discerning between those two things, whether something is a curse or a blessing, is often very blurry. And I think about, it's definitely more obvious in the story of Arachne, where Athena says, if you think you are the best weaver in all of Greece, well then weave for the rest of your life. And it's laced with irony, sure, but also, you think about it subversively, like how are the children of Lear cursed? Is Medusa cursed? These kind of questions surrounding the motivations, maybe absolutely.
that is very interesting. The use of transformation as a hindrance or a blessing. Is there any examples of transness in Celtic mythology? I know there is a few examples in Roman, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, quite a lot in Roman.
In Celtic?
I would say not really. There are a few, but we have kind of classical writers. I think I'm thinking of kind of Aristotle and like Diodorus, who were historians and writers, as well as obviously being philosophers, that have attested to that like it was like that same-sex activity and queerness definitely was very commonplace among the warrior class, and how disgusted they were, that is the Romans, about how that kind of defiled their own pederastic ideal, and that is to say, pederastic meaning the love between an elder man and a younger man, and how same-sex relationships between men of the same age was very, very commonplace in Celtic mythology. As for transness, I think that the only instance that I can immediately jump out would be the Dagda, and there are, which would be who was the head of the Tuatha Dé Danann. And there is, rather than transness, there is some gender ambiguity, shall we say, in which things like pronouns are swapped. But I'm thinking of, there's another. So basically, the big Tuatha Dé Danann battle was called the Maitura. And there's a scene where the Dagda is sent to spy on a group of people called the Fumaronians. And in the English version of this kind of epic, he's described as having what is referenced as a wheeled fork, right? And it's a weird description of a person, and we're not, there's some kind of debate about it, but the accepted definition is that because the fact that the Irish word gowl is used, and gowl does mean a fork, but it means like a fork in a tree. And the fork in a tree usually looks like this.
Yeah.
Right? And if you flip that this way.
Is there any similarities between that word gowl and the modern use of the word gowl?
I would say so. I mean, it is often meant in the context of archaic Irish, was used to mean genitalia, specifically female genitalia. So, I mean, very much so. I think the etymology of gowl as just the kind of like, oh, he's he's a gowl, he's like not, as more of an exclamation more than anything else with any meaning. I think the evolution of that language is really interesting. But there's also, the Dagda has a harp, which is Uithne, they call it, and it means childbirth. So it's just kind of that the sons of like Bowen, which is another character, were the three chants of Uithne. So it's like the sorrow strain, the joy strain, and the sleep strange, the sleep strain. And it talks about femininity and womanhood, but the Dagda is usually in art, and if you search the Dagda, is pretty much exclusively presented as a male, as a tall male, as a quite a heavy set male. And it's kind of, but I just think it's interesting. Language is often used rather than anything very direct. But I would say that more than anything else in Celtic mythology, it's that, like I said about in Roman, in the Metamorphosis, that subversion of gender expectations more than explicit references to transness. Meanwhile, in the Metamorphosis and in classical Roman society, there are very, very explicit references. Less about, well, yes, definitely the trans body, but also very heavily in art, the intersex body as well, and the harmony of especially a female torso and a male bottom half, anatomically that is, was a concept utilized by the ancient Romans and the ancient, not so much the ancient Greeks, but definitely some of them. The ancient Greeks loved depictions of penises. I don't know what it was. They were obsessed with it, and they worshipped this thing actually called the phallus.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so through that worship of that, I think that the Romans really used the intersex and the trans body as some form of almost spectacle. And that's referenced in it's one of my favorite pieces of portraiture, but I find it to be very problematic. It's the Sleeping Hermaphroditus by Bernini, where when you approach it in the Louvre, and it's a beautiful portrait
behind, and then it's almost,
and then
it was heavily rumored to be used as sort of a party piece of
yes,
and then would, in the classic sense, would the use of a intersex body or transness be used in a positive, sort of almost magical way, or in more of a matter of fact sort of sense?
More matter of fact.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say negative. I would say somewhere definitely more of the kind of indifference that it just happened. It was just a thing that happened, and it was a thing that happened in myth. I think especially of Hermaphroditus, but there are definitely a lot of other examples within the Metamorphosis as well. Ovid was obsessed with this concept of the swapping of male to female and vice versa. And what makes the Hermaphroditus story so compelling to me as a classicist and as a trans classicist at that is that it's facilitated in that transformation while it is a fusion of both the male and female sex, um, is facilitated by the gods.
Mm.
And the story of Salmachus, who is the what's the word I'm looking for? The perpetrator of the sexual violence against Hermaphroditus,
Yeah.
is obviously female anatomically, but Hermaphroditus is described as very androgynous from the beginning. So while Salmachus prays to the gods that the bodies of herself and Hermaphroditus can be joined as one, and the gods obviously grant this request, Hermaphroditus goes further by saying that anybody that is to submerge themselves in the pool of Salmachus will emerge from that pool as a woman. So it explores that concept of fluidity through literal fluid. So it's and the word that Ovid uses to describe Salmachus raping Hermaphroditus is confunditor, which is the Latin word for to surround, but surround as a liquid. So Salmachus becomes a liquid that surrounds the boy and becomes this new hermaphroditic body, which
Almost
which is what the
rebirth.
say again.
Almost like rebirth.
Yes.
In the same way that Venus was birthed in the water.
Yeah, absolutely. And the same way that Venus is birthed very explicitly from the severed testicles of Uranus.
Yeah.
And I think that that again, it's things like that. The brutal murder, and I mean it was a murder of Uranus at the end, but the severing of the testicles, this you know there's some very graphic, both artistic and literary descriptions of it oozing with semen and blood that is thrown into the water. And it's this like masculine, bloodshed and murder and death, death, death. And then suddenly the epitome of, hyper femininity emerges from this water. The Botticelli painting, obviously the Venus of is obviously, while not accurate, it's obviously a very romanticized version of the story. Is a very good depiction of that dichotomy between the actual way that Aphrodite was born, and the way that she was born and how she is presented as the goddess of love. I just think that the Romans really got their dichotomy down. Whether they got their gender politics down is a completely different question, and the answer is no to that question, by the way.
Yeah.
They really understood the fluidity of gender and sex.
They also really caught it onto the head of it. It's not only medical, it is purely in the minds of people. You can be completely submerged in this water and come out presenting as a woman, yet you've been a woman the whole time.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
don't act different as soon as you leave the water. It's purely appearance, and
absolutely.
there's a lot with the gods transforming into women or to trick people. It is purely they are showing it in the way that it is purely a performance.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. And I think that the gods use the transformations into their opposite gender, their opposite sex, to their advantage, so that they can engage in sexual relations or just simply rape the woman.
Yeah.
I think, for example, of the story of Helios, like the one that I mentioned before, where where Helios transforms into the mother of the girl that he eventually rapes, and it does not engage in sexual relations with her in that form, but uses the female body, as it were, to gain yes, exactly, to gain access and the trust of this girl. And I think that the difference between that and someone like Hermaphroditus in the Metamorphosis, for example, is that Hermaphroditus is described, like I said from the beginning, as a very androgynous character, and has, I think the quote is, I'll see if I can find it here, but that the quote literally is to the extent that he has a female face and that he has a female air about him. And I think the difference between, for example, Hermaphroditus and his transformation into the hermaphroditic body that we now come to know is that his transformation was accidental but with intent, whereas the transformation of the deities into a body, yeah.
It is very interesting. Does it translate at all in a biblical sense?
That's a good question, and I think one that I can't really answer an awful lot about because I'm not a great biblical scholar. I am one
No.
of,
Yeah.
a little bit, but I think that I think that the sense of gender is a lot more defined in the Bible, compared to a lot of classical literature. I think if we were to say if we were to view the Bible as a piece of literature, which it is, but as in take the religion out of it, I think that something like the contrived nature of gender and the way that it's so explicitly mentioned um in Ovid especially, but in kind of when we look at it properly, um I think that biblical authors and biblical and I think especially of kind of New Testament rather than Old Testament
Yeah.
is there definitely are trans references in the Bible, um and I think references to kind of uh you know okay, yes, God created male and female and blessed their marital union in Genesis, but I think that when you look at the Roman solution, hermaphroditus in that sense is never explicitly said to not be to not still be a boy. And he's a boy, he's not a man, he's a boy. Um and when the fusion between Hermaphroditus and Salmachus occurs, Hermaphroditus retains his maleness that he had up until that point. But as you said, it is still it is still dominated by this feminine energy, which has now only been exacerbated by the fusion between the two peoples. So I think if you look at the Bible under the lens of Roman gender politics and literature, because not in the reality was that the Romans really were quite rotten to their women. Um, I think that in biblical context, it would have been something very difficult for biblical scholars to get their head around this kind of concept of the fluidity of gender, especially when you look at Genesis.
Yeah. It is very interesting. The transness of classics. Obviously, that is your preferred study and your part in your place in the classics world. And it's very interesting to sort of bring forth the concepts of gender in Roman to Greek to biblical, and then bringing it all the way back to the Celts. Um,
Absolutely.
it's a very nuanced conversation between all of the
Hugely nuanced, and it doesn't even stop in Europe. Like there's huge discussions about gender politics in Mesoamerican culture, and in the classical Middle East and the classical Far East, and what we understand to be, obviously the Middle East is a modern term, but what we understand as kind of the classical Islamic world, and what we understand about gender politics there, and gender politics in the far eastern, when we think about like classical China and classical, and as it existed, obviously back then it wasn't called China, but yeah, when we think about this, it really is a global conversation surrounding how gender functioned, and especially how antithesis is, that's a mouthful, how the antitheses of gender were not only presented very like with minimal warning, like no, there was no kind of like censoring of it, and there was no censoring of the hermaphroditus story. It was just how it was. It's just what happened. And I think I think you're right though. It demands rather than anything else a very nuanced world conversation surrounding those links between.
because it is so much more detailed than our current view on gender, which is constantly changing and would change depending on who you ask. But as if we are talking about the general populace of how they view gender, it is a hugely Eurocentric idea. And
Very
not
much so.
just Eurocentric, but very Mediterranean in the way that you think of gender, which has spanned all throughout the world, where I think most people would come to the same conclusion. It is a fully colonized idea of gender that has been completely drilled into everyone due to globalization.
Absolutely. 100%. And I think that that's why the movement to abolish gender has very much now moved to the decolonialization of gender, because there are aspects of culture, I think, especially of Native American culture, and I think especially of Eastern cultures, where gender is a very important but also very fluid part of their cultures, which should be allowed to thrive and haven't been allowed to thrive because of Eurocentric ideals of colonialism and imperialism. And I think that I myself was very much the kind of person like, oh, like abolish gender, gender doesn't exist, but it does, and it's important to recognize that, and it's important to recognize how it exists rather than forcing it, rather forcing a unilogical idea of gender. I think it's important to recognize how it exists in different microcosms of society, and that's especially true for the classical world as well.
Yeah, I think it's very important to to recognize, and I think it also, and we're bringing it back to the Celts again, but it's important to recognize your own family history of gender, and to think about,
Mm,
why do I think that gender is such a way? Is it because I was raised this way, and how did my great 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 all the way back on the family tree think about gender? How did my
mm.
nation think of gender before the uh, sanitized Christian version of gender, the Adams and the Eves, and then that's it, and sort of took over the globe, the thinking about
Very
gender.
much so. Yeah, and I think looking at it like genealogically as well is such an interesting way of tracing back you just general beliefs, And I think especially in Ireland, it will invariably trace back to the church more often than not, and it will trace back to one. It'll for me anyway. In my family, very definitely will trace back to one of two things. It will trace back to the Catholic Church, or it will trace back to the colonialization of Ireland. My mum lived on the border essentially between the north and she lived in Donegal. She lived on the border between the north and Derry, basically, and very much. And her whole family has lived there her whole life, and the family of the Friel family has lived in Donegal their whole lives, and essentially they have seen the passing of time, and they have seen the colonialization
Yeah,
uh, of Ireland. And when I mean far back, my dad, oh my god, big into his ancestry, loves the Library of Public Records. We've traced our family back to I think the 1500s,
yeah, yeah.
and pretty much has stayed exclusively in kind of North Donegal, so has seen the kind of the way that um
Organization is
you know,
taking
absolutely. But even the name Dún Fort of the Foreigners, it literally is it was at one point a British stronghold. So definitely, I think the genealogical tracing of ideals and morals in general, yes, but also I think specifically looked at gender are just so interesting.
Yeah, I'm very interested in decolonizing Ireland as which is kind of a selfish act of doing my own country first, but decolonizing the world is very important,
Yes,
and to educate people on the nuances that sometimes have been erased from history.
yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you so much for talking to me about this.
No problem. It's
Where
my
can
pleasure.
people find you?
So you can catch me mostly on either Twitter or Instagram. So my Instagram is Dan Bisset. My Twitter is Daniel Bisset. I added the extra syllable. But also I do have a blog that I write about classics and I post articles on, and that's just gbclassics.blogspot.com. It's also in my Twitter bio, so
Yeah.
if that's easier.
And also, if people want to listen to more of you, you had a conversation with the Mary Beard this
Yes.
week, talking mostly about, somewhat about transness in classics, but mostly about transness in a contemporary sense, and a lot about social media and accountability.
Yes, and that's available. There is a tweet floating around with the link. So that's a there is a tweet floating around somewhere. But
I can link.
uh, yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So, but it is if you just look, the video is called Trans in Classics. If you search that up on YouTube, I think it is the first thing that comes up. I'll just double check that. But yeah, it was a very stimulating conversation. I really enjoyed it, and Mary seemed
I loved listening to
she say again.
I loved listening to it. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It was a really interesting conversation to have. It's the third. If you look up trans in classics, it's the third thing to come up after a playlist of classic trans anthems. Sorry, classic trance anthems mix from 1999 to 2001. So
Awesome. So if you
So
want to
that's
listen
right.
to that and then listen to some trance music as a palette cleanser,
Yeah.
then
At the same time.
yeah,
Yeah, very much
might
so. Thank you so much
underscore
for having me.
the conversation.
Oh yes, absolutely. Like you have to, you start it, you click play at the same time on
Oh,
both
it's like
browsers. I guess that's not
Dark Side of the Moon and The Wizard of Oz.
yes, very much so. Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan.
No bother, my pleasure.
Stop recording.